June 14, 1945. Keweenaw Peninsula, northern shore of Lake Superior. Marine biologist Elwood Percival Whitmore slit open the belly of a lake trout and stopped breathing. No eggs. Instead, a mass the size of a child's fist, dense, nodular, threading through tissue like roots through cracked pavement. The texture was wrong. Not the familiar consistency of roe or normal tissue, but something harder, almost fibrous, with a faint iridescent sheen that caught the afternoon light streaming through the lab shed's single window. This was the 9th fish in a row. 9 out of 9 caught that day. 100%. A statistical impossibility made real, the kind of data point that rewrites textbooks or ends careers. Elwood set his scalpel on the metal tray with a soft clink that seemed too loud in the silence. The smell of fish blood and formaldehyde hung thick in the cramped space. He peeled off his rubber gloves slowly, methodically, the way he did everything, and dropped them in the waste bin. His hands were shaking. He noticed this with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. When had they started shaking? He walked out of the laboratory shed onto the rocky shore. The late afternoon sun slanted across Lake Superior, turning the water from steel gray to molten copper. The lake stretched before him, endless, cold, indifferent. Waves lapped at the granite shore with a sound like breathing. Somewhere out there, a loon called, its cry echoing across the water, that strange, haunting laugh that always sounded like madness. The cleanest freshwater lake in North America. That's what the textbook said. That's what they announced on the radio in those cheerful government broadcasts about American natural resources, American bounty, American exceptionalism. That's what it was supposed to be. But the numbers in his field notebook told a different story. A story someone desperately didn't want him to tell. Elwood stood there on the shore, wind pulling at his wool jacket, and felt the weight of knowledge pressing down on him like a physical force. He was 35 years old. He had dedicated his life to understanding the living world, to the careful accumulation of facts, to the slow, patient work of science. And now he understood with terrible clarity that all of that meant nothing in the face of institutional power. To understand how Elwood ended up on that shore, you need to go back 3 years, to the moment his fate was sealed over a cup of cold coffee in the office of the director of the Federal Fisheries Research Station. Madison, Wisconsin, March 1942. Elwood was 32 years old, young, promising, with a fresh doctorate in aquatic biology from the University of Michigan, author of 2 published monographs on Great Lakes salmonids. His dissertation on the feeding ecology of lake trout had won the Baird Award for Outstanding Research in Freshwater Biology. A thick manuscript that detailed 3 years of fieldwork, thousands of stomach content analyses, intricate food web diagrams showing the flow of energy through the ecosystem. His colleagues respected him for his meticulousness and integrity, qualities valued in science but not always welcomed in practice. He was the type who checked his data 3 times before writing it down, who refused to massage results to fit a convenient hypothesis, who would rewrite an entire year's work if he found an error in his calculations. During his doctoral defense, one committee member had asked him to explain a discrepancy between his findings and accepted theory. Elwood had spent 20 minutes calmly dismantling the accepted theory with data. The committee had passed him unanimously, but several professors had looked uncomfortable. His professors had called him brilliant but inflexible. His peers called him Elwood the Exacting. He took it as a compliment. Science was supposed to be exact. Truth was supposed to be inflexible. Wasn't that the whole point? He'd grown up in Grand Rapids, son of a machinist and a school teacher. His father, Theodore Whitmore, had worked at the Bissell factory for 32 years, operating the same lathe, producing parts machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore, his father used to say, measuring finished parts with calipers, rejecting anything that deviated from specification by even a fraction. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, underscore, underscore. That ethic had shaped Elwood's entire approach to life. His mother, Eleanor, had taught 8th grade English and insisted on grammatical precision with the same fervor her husband applied to mechanical tolerances. Elwood had inherited both parents' obsessive attention to detail, their belief that approximation was a form of dishonesty. He'd been summoned by the station director, Dr. Virgil Drummond, silver-haired, imposing, with a Navy Cross from the Great War pinned to his lapel, even though he wore civilian clothes. A man whose word was law in American freshwater biology. Drummond had written the definitive text on Great Lakes ecology. His letters of recommendation opened doors. His disapproval closed them permanently. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Trophy fish mounted on the walls, massive muskellunge, northern pike with teeth like daggers, a lake sturgeon nearly 6 feet long caught in Lake Michigan in 1927. Drummond's desk was mahogany, polished to a mirror shine, covered with neat stacks of papers weighted down with geological specimens used as paperweights. __quote _2 __. Drummond gestured to a chair with one hand while tamping tobacco into his pipe with the other. His movements were precise, economical. Military bearing never fully faded. On his desk lay a folder stamped __quote _3 _ in red ink. Elwood sat. He was wearing his only good suit, dark blue wool that was already showing wear at the elbows. His shoes needed resoling. The salary at the research station wasn't generous, and with the war on, everything cost more. We have an assignment of national importance. Drummond lit his pipe, and fragrant smoke curled toward the ceiling. Keweenaw Peninsula, restricted military zone. We need long-term monitoring of fish populations, 3 years minimum. Complete isolation, solo operation, Spartan conditions. But the significance of this research cannot be overstated. He paused, studying Elwood with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. The war effort requires industrial expansion near the Great Lakes. Copper mining in Michigan has tripled. We're building Liberty ships in Duluth. The factories in Detroit and Cleveland are running 3 shifts. All of this creates pressure on the lake ecosystems. We need baseline data. We need to know what's normal so we can measure any changes. This isn't glamorous work, Dr. Whitmore. It's essential work. Elwood nodded. He'd always dreamed of such work. No administrative meetings, no departmental politics, no need to smile at the right people at fundraising dinners while they patronized him about fish. Just him, Lake Superior, and science. The pure pursuit of knowledge. Isn't that what had drawn him to biology in the first place? Not the laboratory politics or the grant applications or the endless committees, but the simple act of understanding how the living world worked. I accept, Dr. Drummond. Excellent. Drummond slid the folder toward him. Standard methodology, monthly sampling, biometrics, histology. You'll send data by courier every 2 months. We'll process it, prepare it for publication. Standard protocol. The war won't last forever, and when it ends, we'll need comprehensive environmental assessments. Your work will be the foundation of that. He paused and looked Elwood directly in the eyes. One condition. No independent publications until project completion. This is comprehensive research, requires centralized analysis. Multiple study sites across the Great Lakes, all coordinated through this office. Individual publications would fragment the data, reduce its impact. We need to publish it together, as a unified body of work. Understood? Elwood understood. That's how science worked. He was a cog in a larger machine, and that was fine. Science was collaborative. Science built on itself, researcher by researcher, dataset by dataset. His father had been a machinist in a textile mill, understood the value of precision work done well even when no one would remember your name. Elwood had inherited that ethic. Quote 11, quote 12. Drummond stood and extended his hand. Quote 13, quote, the handshake was firm, dry, brief. Professional. Elwood walked out of that office feeling like he'd won the lottery. 3 years of pure research. 3 years to do nothing but the work he loved. 3 years to contribute to the war effort in the way he knew best. Not with a rifle, not with propaganda, but with careful science that would help preserve America's natural resources. He was naive. He understands that now, looking back. But in March 1942, with the world at war and America still reeling from Pearl Harbor, naivety felt like patriotism. The first months on Keweenaw were paradise. Elwood lived in a small timber cabin 20 yards from the shore. It was simple but well built, sturdy log construction with a pitched roof, 2 rooms plus a small storage loft. Electricity from a diesel generator that chugged away in a shed behind the cabin, producing enough power for lights and the refrigeration units in the lab. Wood stove heating that required constant feeding during the cold months. A pump well 30 paces away that pulled clean, cold water from deep underground. The laboratory shed stood nearby, connected to the cabin by a gravel path. It was newer than the cabin, built specifically for this project. Equipped with everything necessary. 2 Bausch & Lomb microscopes, one for low magnification work and one for histological analysis. A refrigerated centrifuge for separating tissue samples. 3 refrigeration units for specimen storage. Racks of reagents and stains for tissue preparation. Glassware gleaming on shelves. A full set of dissection instruments. Scales calibrated to measure fish down to the gram. Calipers for morphometric measurements. Preservative jars of every size. A small darkroom for developing photographs, complete with an enlarger and chemical baths. It was better equipped than most university labs. The nearest town 40 miles away by water. Contact once a week when a supply boat brought provisions and mail. The boat was piloted by a taciturn Finn named Aino Makela, who asked no questions and delivered what he was paid to deliver. He was maybe 60, weathered as driftwood, with hands scarred from decades of rope and network. He spoke English with a thick accent and usually said nothing more than quote 14 and quote 15 when he arrived. But Elwood didn't need conversation. He had his work. He worked from dawn to dusk, and the work gave him a satisfaction he'd never found in university politics. Rose before the sun, 3:30 a.m. in summer, 5 a.m. in fall, made coffee on the wood stove, ate a quick breakfast of oatmeal or eggs, then walked down to the shore in the cold gray light that turned Lake Superior into hammered silver. The boat was a 14-foot aluminum skiff with a small outboard motor, nothing fancy, but reliable. He'd learned to read Superior's moods in those first weeks, the way the wind shifted, the subtle color changes that warned of coming storms, the particular chop that meant safe passage or dangerous crossing. He marked his positions carefully on waterproof charts using landmarks, the distinctive split boulder on the shore, the lone white pine on the ridge, the shape of the coastline against the sky. Set gill nets at different depths, surface nets for cisco, midwater nets for whitefish, deep nets for lake trout. Different distances from shore, near shore for juveniles, offshore for mature populations. He rotated locations methodically to avoid oversampling any one area, following a grid system he designed during his doctoral work. Standard fisheries methodology, proven by decades of research. Then back to the lab to process yesterday's catch while today's nets filled. The lab became his sanctuary. The smell of formalin and fish, the clink of glass instruments, the scratch of pencil on data sheets. He developed routines that felt almost ritualistic. Weigh, measure, photograph, dissect, sample, preserve, record. Each step performed with the same careful precision his father had brought to machining crankshafts. He kept detailed logs of everything: weather conditions, water temperature at different depths, Secchi disc readings for water clarity, plankton tow samples, observations of bird activity, notes on unusual occurrences. Science was built from such details, from the patient accumulation of facts that eventually revealed patterns. He was adding his small contribution to humanity's understanding of the natural world, and that felt meaningful. Superior was generous those first months. Lake trout, whitefish, cisco, clean, healthy, beautiful fish, exactly as they should be in unpolluted water. The trout averaged 3 to 4 pounds, thick-bodied and firm-fleshed, with the characteristic spotting of a healthy population. The whitefish ran silver and plump. The cisco were small jewels, scales flashing like coins. He examined each one methodically, measured length from snout to tail fork, weighed them to the nearest gram, counted fin rays and gill rakers, examined scales under magnification to age them by counting annual rings like tree growth, dissected specimens to examine internal organs, looking for parasites, disease, developmental abnormalities, collected tissue samples for histological analysis, slicing organs into thin sections, fixing them in formalin, preparing slides to examine cellular structure. His field notebooks grew thick with data, each page covered with neat handwriting, tables of measurements, sketches of unusual specimens, observations about water temperature, clarity, weather conditions. He photographed everything significant with a Graflex camera, producing sharp black and white images that documented each detail. The work was meditative, repetitive in the best way. Each fish a puzzle to solve, a story to read in scales and bones and tissue. What had it eaten? How old was it? How fast had it grown? Was it healthy or stressed? Did it show any signs of environmental impact? His first report went out in August 1942. 40 pages of typed text on the Underwood typewriter in the cabin, pecked out with 2 fingers late into the night. Tables of biometric data, graphs showing size distributions, photographs of tissue samples. Everything by the book, everything meticulous. He packed it carefully in a waterproof folder and gave it to Makela when the supply boat came. A month later, a response came. A brief note from Drummond, typed on official letterhead. Quote, _16__. Normal scientific process. Preliminary data always required verification. That's how peer review worked. Second report in October. Third in December. Everything on schedule. Everything proceeding as planned. Winter came hard. Superior began to freeze in November, ice spreading from the shore like a white infection. By December, the boat was useless. Makela made 2 more trips in January, piloting through increasingly narrow channels of open water, then stopped coming entirely. The lake was frozen solid. Contact cut off until spring. Elwood didn't mind. He had his books, his notes, his specimens preserved in jars. He spent the long, dark months analyzing data, writing detailed descriptions, reading scientific journals by kerosene lamp when he needed to conserve generator fuel. The isolation was almost spiritual. Just him and the frozen lake and the stars wheeling overhead in skies so clear and cold they seemed to crack. But in the spring of 1943, something changed. Elwood didn't notice it immediately. The ice broke in late March, and by early April he was setting nets again, eager to see what the winter had brought. At first, everything seemed normal. Maybe the trout in his nets were running slightly smaller. Not critical, within natural variation. Population dynamics fluctuated. A cold winter could slow growth. Nothing alarming. Then in May, he found several specimens with strange pigmentation on their gills. Dark patches, almost black, irregular in shape. Not parasites, he checked carefully under magnification. Not fungal growth. Just areas where the gill tissue had darkened, the normal pink fading to charcoal gray. He'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of studying fish. He documented the findings meticulously, photographed the affected gills from multiple angles, made detailed drawings in his field notebook, noting the exact location and extent of each patch. Preserved the gill tissue in formalin for later histological analysis. Cut thin sections, mounted them on slides, stained them with hematoxylin and eosin to examine the cellular structure. Under the microscope, the tissue looked wrong. The normal architecture of gill lamellae was disrupted. Blood vessels were dilated, engorged. He saw signs of inflammation, cellular damage. It looked like chemical exposure, but from what? This was Lake Superior, the cleanest freshwater in the world. He sent all of this to the station in his June report. Detailed descriptions, measurements, photographs, preserved samples carefully packaged to survive the journey. The response came 6 weeks later, not from Drummond, but from his deputy, Dr. Leonard Kessler. A man Elwood barely knew. He'd met Kessler once at a conference, remembered him as thin, nervous, with a habit of polishing his glasses when he talked. "Dear Dr. Whitmore, your observations regarding gill pigmentation are quite interesting. However, your documentation methodology requires adjustment. We are sending revised data tables showing corrected figures. Please use these formats in your future work. Your photographic techniques also need refinement. The enclosed guidelines should help. Respectfully, Dr. L. Kessler." Elwood unfolded the enclosed tables and couldn't believe his eyes. This was his data, his numbers, but altered. The average trout weight he'd recorded as 3.2 pounds now read as 4.1. The percentage of specimens with gill pigmentation, he'd noted 23%. The returned version showed 3%. All anomalies smoothed out, all warning signs erased. He sat at his desk in the cabin and reread the letter 3 times, trying to understand. __quote _18 __. But the methodology was standard, proven, the very one he'd been trained to use in graduate school. He hadn't done anything wrong. His scales were calibrated against test weights. His calipers were accurate to a millimeter. His photographic techniques followed standard protocols. Unless the methodology wasn't the problem. Unless the problem was that his methodology was too accurate. Elwood sat down and wrote a response. Polite, academic, carefully worded. He noted that his measurements followed ASTM standards for fisheries research, that all instruments were regularly calibrated, that he maintained detailed calibration logs available for inspection. He was willing to repeat any procedures in question, but remained confident in his data's accuracy. He requested specific feedback on which aspects of his methodology required adjustment and why. He gave the letter to Makela in July, waited for a response. No response for 2 months. And the fish kept changing. By summer 1943, Elwood could no longer ignore the obvious. In his catches, the number of specimens with deformities was growing. Curved spines that made fish swim with a characteristic wobble. Underdeveloped fins, particularly the pectorals, giving the fish a lopsided appearance. Tumors in the abdominal cavity, small at first, just nodules in the liver or spleen, but growing larger and more frequent with each passing month. First, a few per 100 fish examined, then dozens. By fall, every 5th fish showed some kind of pathology. He methodically documented everything, photographed every anomaly from multiple angles, kept detailed protocols noting the exact nature and extent of each abnormality, preserved samples according to standard regulations, labeling each jar with specimen number, date, location, type of tissue, nature of pathology. His field notebooks became a chronicle of slow catastrophe, page after page of measurements and observations recording the decline. In October 1943, another response from the station arrived, again from Kessler, again with __quote _19 tables. The numbers had been smoothed like hair in an official portrait, reality replaced with comfortable illusion. Where Elwood had noted a 19% deformity rate, the corrected figures showed 4%. Where he'd recorded average weights declining, the corrected data showed steady increases. For the first time in 18 months of isolation, Elwood felt real fear. Not from the fish, not from the pathologies, from understanding that someone was deliberately hiding the truth. This wasn't scientific disagreement. This wasn't methodological debate. This was falsification. He started keeping 2 sets of records. One official, which he sent to the station, sanitized numbers that would pass without comment. Another real one, which he hid in a sealed ammunition can buried under the floorboards of the lab shed. Every measurement duplicated. Every photograph existed in 2 copies. One version of reality for them, another for history. For whoever might someday need to know what had really happened. The winter of 1943 to 44 was long and brutal. Superior froze in November, earlier than the previous year. Contact with the mainland cut off until spring. Elwood remained alone in his cabin, feeding the wood stove, rationing generator fuel, reading by kerosene lamp when the diesel ran low, and thinking. He thought about what could be causing the pathologies. Industrial discharge seemed impossible. Keweenaw was in a restricted military zone, the nearest factory hundreds of miles away. Mining activity? But copper mining produced different kinds of contamination, heavy metals that showed different pathology patterns. He'd read studies of mining impacts on aquatic ecosystems. This didn't match. Radiation? Rumors circulated in the scientific community about secret research, about uranium enrichment, about weapons programs. But those were just rumors, whispered speculation at conferences. Nobody really knew what the government was doing behind closed doors. And radiation damage would show different cellular changes. He'd seen the literature on radiation effects on living tissue. This wasn't quite the same. Testing? Of what? Chemical weapons? Biological weapons? The Geneva Protocol prohibited such things, but the protocol dated from 1925, and everyone knew wartime made different rules. He didn't know. But with each day of winter isolation, his certainty grew. Someone knew the answer and was doing everything to keep it secret. In spring 1944, when the ice broke and contact resumed, Elwood received a letter. Not from Kessler, from Drummond himself. The envelope was heavy, official stationery, and when Elwood opened it, his hands were shaking again. __quote _20 __. Elwood read the letter and felt a wave of cold realization wash over him like Superior's icy water. They weren't just correcting him, they were warning him. The language was polite. Drummond was always polite, but the meaning was unmistakable. Shut up, work, don't ask questions. But he couldn't stay silent. Because in May 1944, something happened that changed everything. He set his nets in the morning, as usual. 3 nets at different depths in his standard sampling area. Checked them 6 hours later, the interval that gave best results without stressing the fish too much. 43 trout in the nets. Not one alive. All dead, though they couldn't have drowned in the nets. Their gill covers moved freely, no signs of physical trauma. They died from something else. Elwood brought them to the lab and began dissection, working quickly before the tissue degraded. What he saw didn't fit any pathology he knew. The gills were covered with slime of unusual consistency, not the normal mucus coating, but something thicker, oily, with a faint metallic sheen that caught the light. Internal organs were enlarged, especially the liver and spleen. Livers dark, almost black, swollen to twice normal size, and in the stomachs of several fish, he found remains of plankton that glowed pale green in darkness. He turned off the lab lights to be sure. The plankton continued glowing, soft, ghostly luminescence, like foxfire in the woods. But this wasn't bioluminescent plankton. Lake Superior had no naturally bioluminescent species. This was something else. Elwood took samples, photographed them with long exposures to capture the faint glow, documented everything with the methodical precision that was second nature to him. Then, he walked outside and looked north, toward the restricted zone. Toward the peninsula's tip where he'd been explicitly forbidden to go. Where, according to his maps, there was nothing but forest and rock. That night, he heard trucks. Heavy vehicles on a road that officially didn't exist. Deep rumbling through the darkness, heading north. He stood outside in the cold spring air, listening. Counted at least 6 vehicles, maybe more. When morning came, the sound was gone. Over the following weeks, he noticed patterns. Every 2 weeks, the trucks came at night. Usually on nights without moon, when darkness was deepest. And every time they came, within 3 days, he'd find dead fish in his nets. Not many. A dozen, maybe 2 dozen. But consistent. Predictable. A pattern no scientist could ignore. He started mapping the correlations. truck arrivals, fish kills, wind direction, water currents, water temperature. Drew up detailed charts, plotted the data points. A picture emerged. Something was being transported to the north. Something was being dumped, or buried, or stored. And whatever it was killing Superior. The question was, what to do about it? In July 1944, he broke protocol. He didn't send his regular report to the station. Instead, he wrote a letter to an old classmate, Warren Latham, who worked for the Army Corps of Engineers in Detroit. They'd studied together at Michigan, shared a dorm room, stayed up late arguing about ecology and evolution and the future of American science. Warren was solid, trustworthy, and well-connected in military circles. If anyone could investigate without immediately triggering official retaliation, it was Warren. Elwood told him about the fish, the pathologies, the glowing plankton, the trucks in the night. He kept the letter factual, scientific, avoiding speculation, just the data and the patterns. He ended with a simple request, quote, 21. He gave the letter to Makela with an extra $5, more than the boat captain's weekly wage. Post this in Marquette. Don't mention it to anyone. Makela looked at the envelope, looked at Elwood, nodded once, put the letter in his jacket pocket, said nothing. 3 weeks later, 2 men in civilian clothes arrived on the supply boat. They identified themselves as representatives of the War Production Board, showed credentials, official government identification with photographs, seals, signatures, embossed with eagles and shields. Polite, professional, utterly cold. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a crew cut and eyes like ice. The other shorter, thinner, with wire-rimmed glasses and a face that revealed nothing. They wore suits that looked expensive, shoes polished to a mirror shine, completely out of place in the wilderness. They walked into his cabin without invitation, surveyed the space with quick, efficient glances, the desk covered with field notes, the bookshelf sagging with textbooks and journals, the wood stove radiating heat, the smell of coffee and kerosene. The tall one picked up Elwood's field notebook from the desk, flipped through it without asking permission, set it down. __quote _23___. Elwood's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Years of presenting research findings to skeptical professors had taught him to maintain composure under pressure. I wrote to a colleague about anomalous findings. Standard professional correspondence. Scientists communicate with each other. That's how science works. Not when that science is classified. The tall one pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, lit one without offering to share. Your colleague, Warren Latham, contacted his supervisor at the Corps of Engineers, mentioned receiving unusual communications about Lake Superior fish populations. His supervisor contacted the regional office. They contacted Army Intelligence. Army Intelligence contacted us. Now we're here, and you're going to stop being a problem. Your colleague contacted his superiors. They contacted us. This research is now classified under the Espionage Act of 1917, Section 793. All materials, all data, all correspondence related to this project is government property. Unauthorized disclosure constitutes a federal crime punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Doctor? I understand you're trying to intimidate me. No. The shorter one spoke for the first time, voice soft, almost gentle. We're trying to educate you about the reality of your situation. You signed a contract with the Federal Fisheries Research Station. That contract included non-disclosure provisions. You accepted government funding to conduct this research. That makes your findings government property. You don't own this data anymore, Dr. Whitmore. We do. But the fish are dying. Entire populations showing pathological changes. The fish are not your concern, Dr. Whitmore. The tall one stepped closer, and Elwood could smell tobacco and aftershave. Your concern is following protocol. You will send your data through official channels only. You will discuss your work with no one outside the approved chain of command. You will complete your assigned duties without further attempts to contact external parties. Is that clear? I'm a scientist. I have an obligation to report my findings accurately. To the scientific community, to the public, to anyone who... You have an obligation to your country. The voice was hard now, all pretense of politeness gone. We are fighting a war on two fronts. American boys are dying in Europe and the Pacific, dying by the thousands. And you want to slow down critical war production because of some dead fish? What's killing them? What's in the north? What are they dumping? The shorter one adjusted his glasses with one finger, that nervous gesture. Dr. Whitmore, we're at war. Real war, not the kind you read about in newspapers. The kind where cities burn and entire populations are exterminated. We're fighting enemies who would destroy everything American civilization represents. What we're doing here, in this region, in this project, contributes to ending that war, to winning that war, to saving American lives and preserving American freedom. He paused. Let the words sink in. Your fish? Your scientific curiosity? Your professional ethics? Those are luxuries we can't afford right now. Men are making far greater sacrifices than keeping silent about fish pathology. You'll do your job, keep your mouth shut, and when the war's over, when we've won, when American boys come home, then you can publish all the papers you want, write books, win awards. Until then, you follow orders, like every other American. I'm a scientist, not a soldier. My duty is to truth, not... Your duty is to shut the hell up and do what you're told. The tall one ground out his cigarette on Elwood's desk, leaving a small black mark. A message. 43. The shorter one produced a folder from his briefcase, laid it on the desk. 46. 47. The tall one leaned down, face inches from Elwood's. That's how a court will see it. That's how a jury will see it. That's how history will see it. You'll be remembered as the traitor who tried to sabotage the war effort over fish. Is that what you want? Elwood said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had him completely. We didn't come here to threaten you. The shorter one's voice returned to that gentle, reasonable tone. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 50, underscore, underscore. They left. Elwood stood on the shore and watched the supply boat disappear across the water. Understood finally. He was trapped. Not by water, not by isolation, by something larger than himself. The war machine, the national interest, the greater good. He kept working, kept documenting, but now every report he sent was sanitized. Acceptable numbers, reassuring trends, data that wouldn't raise questions. The truth went into the ammunition can under the floorboards, layer by layer, week by week. By late 1944, the pathologies had worsened dramatically. Now, more than half his catch showed abnormalities. He found fish with eyes clouded white like cataracts, blind and starving. Fish with fins rotted to stumps, unable to swim properly. Fish whose flesh, when cut, released a chemical smell that made his eyes water and his throat burn. He began planning. If he couldn't publish, couldn't tell anyone, he would at least preserve the evidence. He photographed everything, kept meticulous records, collected tissue samples in sealed jars. And when the ground thawed in spring 1945, he took his evidence, photographs, tissue samples, detailed notes, sealed them in 2 waterproof ammunition cans, and hiked into the forest. Half a mile north of the station, he found a limestone outcrop with a deep crevice. He buried the cans there, under moss and fallen branches, marked the location on a hand-drawn map. Someday, someone would need this proof. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. Elwood waited for the restrictions to lift, for permission to speak the truth. Instead, in June, he received new orders. The project was being extended indefinitely. He was to continue monitoring until further notice. That's when he found the 9 trout with tumors. June 14, 1945. the day that broke something inside him. He photographed them, documented them according to protocol, then wrote a report with the real numbers. Not sanitized, not adjusted. The raw truth about what was happening to Superior. 2 weeks later, Dr. Drummond himself arrived on a military seaplane, stepped out onto the rocky shore in polished shoes and a gray suit that looked absurd in the wilderness, carried a leather briefcase, moved like a man 20 years younger than his 60-odd years. The pilot stayed with the plane, smoking, pointedly looking away. __quote _52 __. Not a request, an order given in the tone of friendly suggestion. They walked along the shore, away from the cabin, away from the pilot, out where nothing but water and sky could hear them. Drummond lit his pipe as they walked, cupping his hands against the wind off the lake. The smell of tobacco mixed with the smell of Superior, wet stone and pine and something else, that faint metallic tang that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Elwood, Drummond said. First time he'd used his first name in their entire acquaintance. Quote, 54. Quote, 55. Quote, 56. Drummond puffed his pipe, blue smoke trailing behind them. Quote, Drummond stopped walking, turned to face him directly. He gestured broadly at the lake, the forest, the sky. Quote, 61. Quote, 62. Drummond stopped walking, turned to face him directly. Quote, 63. Quote, 64. Quote, 65. Drummond's voice was harder now, the friendly tone evaporating like morning fog. You think your obligation to scientific truth outweighs the greater good. I'm telling you it doesn't. I'm telling you that 10,000 dead fish matter less than 10 million dead people. That's not corruption. That's proportion. That's wisdom. You're not falsifying. You're contextualizing, prioritizing. War production required industrial expansion near the lakes, copper mining, chemical processing, metallurgical operations. All of it created environmental impact. Temporary impact. Localized impact. When the war ended, and it has ended, Elwood, we won. The government would address it. We have plans for remediation, for cleanup, for restoration. But during the war, we couldn't afford to slow production for environmental concerns. Every delay costs American lives. Every week of reduced production means more soldiers die fighting the Japanese. More families receive telegrams. More mothers bury sons. You understand that calculation, don't you? The moral arithmetic? So you just let them poison Superior? One of the greatest. I let them win a war. Drummond's voice was angry now, no longer trying to persuade, just stating facts. He took a breath, visibly calming himself. Drummond's eyes were cold, the warmth completely gone. Espionage Act violations carry 20 years in federal prison. We have your letter to Mr. Latham. That's documentary evidence of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. We can have you arrested today and hold you at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth until you're old and forgotten and no one remembers your name. You'll lose everything. Your career, your reputation, your freedom. And for what? Fish that will be replaced by new fish in a decade? A lake that will recover naturally once the industrial activity ends? You'd do that? Send me to prison? To protect what? A factory? A military project that's already obsolete because the war's over? I'd do that to protect American victory. Drummond's voice was quiet now, but somehow more frightening than when it was loud. He paused, letting the words sink in. Quote, Elwood looked out at the lake, at the endless gray water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, fish were dying, would continue dying, and no one would know. No one would stop it. A said quietly. Quote, Drummond tapped out his pipe against a rock, the small, ritualistic gesture somehow more ominous than any threat. Quote, _84, ___. Drummond left. The seaplane took off, engines roaring across the water. Elwood stayed on the shore until the sound faded to nothing. He worked another year, sending false reports, documenting the truth, watching Superior die around him. The fish kept getting worse. Catches declined. By mid-1946, whole sections of his nets came up empty. The population was collapsing, the ecosystem unraveling. He was witnessing an extinction event in slow motion. In August 1946, they recalled him. Project complete. New assignment available in Montana, studying trout streams in the Rockies. Clean work. Far from Superior. Far from this failure. Elwood refused. Resigned from federal service, moved to Marquette, Michigan, found work teaching high school biology. A quiet life. Anonymous. Safe. But he couldn't let go. The truth was a weight he carried, a stone in his chest that never got lighter. In 1947, he tried to publish, sent a manuscript to the Journal of Fisheries Research, detailing the pathologies without mentioning the location or the classified aspects. Just the science, the patterns, the data that someone needed to see. The journal accepted it, sent galley proofs, scheduled it for the January 1948 issue. It never appeared. 3 days before publication, the journal editor called him. Voice apologetic, embarrassed. We received guidance from a federal agency, national security concerns. We can't publish this material. I'm deeply sorry, Dr. Whitmore. He tried again with ecology. Same result. The American Naturalist. Same. Transactions of the American Fisheries Society. Same. He was blacklisted. Not officially. No one said the words. But every editor, every publication, every scientific venue closed to him. Dr. Virgil Drummond died in 1950, heart attack at his desk. Elwood read the obituary in Science magazine. Pioneer of Great Lakes ecology, dedicated public servant, instrumental in wartime scientific coordination. Not a word about Superior, not a hint of what Drummond had helped conceal. Dr. Leonard Kessler became the new director of the Federal Fisheries Research Station. His first major action was to classify all research related to the Keweenaw project as permanently restricted under the Atomic Energy Act. 50-year seal. The station itself was decommissioned in 1952. The cabin and lab were dismantled, materials sold for salvage. The peninsula became part of a federal wildlife refuge, accessed by special permit only. Elwood taught high school biology in Marquette for the next 23 years. Room 214 in the old brick building on Front Street. Windows overlooking the lake he could no longer study but couldn't stop watching. He arrived early every morning, 6:30 a.m., before the janitors finished mopping the halls, to prepare for his 8 o'clock classes. He was good at it, patient in ways he'd never been as a young professor, able to make complex concepts clear to 15-year-olds who mostly didn't care about cellular respiration or Mendelian genetics. He brought in specimens, fish from Superior, caught by others now, birds found dead by the roadside, plants collected in the woods, demonstrated dissection techniques with the same precision he'd once used for research, made them look through microscopes at paramecium and algae and their own cheek cells, tried to show them the hidden beauty of the living world. Students liked him. He remembered all their names by the second week, stayed after school to help struggling learners, wrote detailed letters of recommendation for college applications. Every spring, he organized a lake cleanup, students collecting garbage from the beach while he taught them about ecosystem health and human impact. None of them knew what he carried inside, what he'd seen, what he knew and couldn't say. Sometimes, during lectures on aquatic ecosystems, he'd catch himself starting to describe the pathologies he'd observed, the patterns of contamination, the slow death of a lake. Then he'd stop, redirect to textbook material, safe information that threatened no one. The students never noticed these pauses, these careful redirections. But he noticed, every single time. In 1955, he tried one more time, wrote to Warren Latham. Warren was retired now, living in Ann Arbor. They met at a diner on Main Street, ordered coffee and pie, talked about old times, wives and children and university gossip and the Tigers' chances this season. And then Elwood told him everything. About Superior, the fish, the pathologies, the buried evidence in the ammunition cans. All of it. Warren listened carefully. When Elwood finished, he was quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee with mechanical repetition. Then he said, "We need to retrieve those cans, while we still can. I have contacts at the university. We could organize it as a research expedition, ecological survey, perfectly legitimate." It's been 10 years. The cans might be compromised. Rust. Moisture. Then we'd better hurry. Before they are. They planned the expedition over the next weeks. Unofficial. Private. Warren had contacts in the geology department who could arrange transport under the guise of a mineral survey. Elwood remembered the exact coordinates, had kept the hand-drawn map all these years. They would go in September, after the tourist season ended. The expedition never happened. In November 1955, Warren Latham died. His car went off the Huron River Bridge outside Ann Arbor. Black ice, the police said. Lost control on the curve. Tragic accident. 53 years old, survived by a wife and 3 children. Elwood attended the funeral, stood by the grave in cold rain, and knew it wasn't an accident. Warren had mentioned their plans to someone. Someone had reported it upward. Someone had made a decision. And Warren had died for it. The certainty sat in Elwood's chest like ice. They'd killed his friend. Because someone was still watching. Because the secret still mattered, even 10 years later. Because some truths were too dangerous to allow. He gave up then, finally understood. The system was stronger than him. It had infinite patience, infinite reach. It could wait decades, then strike with cold precision. It didn't forget. It didn't forgive. It simply eliminated threats. Elwood Percival Whitmore lived another 23 years, taught biology at Marquette High School, lived alone in a small apartment 3 blocks from the lake. Never married. No children. Attended faculty meetings, graded papers, coached the science club, lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He died in March 1978, aged 68. Heart failure. 15 people attended his funeral, colleagues from school, a few former students who remembered him fondly, a distant cousin from Illinois who came out of obligation. None of them knew this quiet biology teacher had once held proof of an environmental crime that could have changed everything. Could have forced accountability, could have prevented future contamination, could have established precedent that would protect ecosystems for generations. But he'd been silenced. And the truth had died with him. Except it hadn't. Not entirely. The ammunition cans stayed in the forest, under moss, under leaf litter, in a limestone crevice half a mile north of the abandoned station site. Maybe they're still there. Maybe rust ate through the metal decades ago, moisture seeping in, destroying photographs, dissolving ink, rotting fabric sample bags. Maybe not. Maybe in that hermetically sealed darkness, the truth about what happened to Superior in the mid-40s still waits for someone to find it. The Keweenaw station site is abandoned now. The lab shed collapsed in the 70s, timbers rotting in the harsh climate. The cabin foundation is barely visible under new growth, birch and aspen reclaiming what humans briefly occupied. Superior laps at the shore, indifferent and eternal, waves wearing down granite grain by grain. The area where Elwood caught his diseased fish is part of the federal refuge now. Tourists aren't allowed. Official reason? Protecting unique ecosystems and sensitive wildlife habitats. But the restricted zone extends further than ecological protection requires. Much further. Sometimes, very rarely, local fishermen venture into restricted waters. It happens. Everyone knows someone who ignored the signs and the patrol boats. And they tell strange stories afterward. About trout that run wrong somehow, Too small, too thin, with growths under the skin. About water in certain spots that tastes metallic, unpleasant, leaves a chemical film on your teeth. About sounds at night, if you listen carefully, a low hum like the lake itself is moaning, like something deep underwater is breathing. Locals don't believe these tales. Superior is clean, they say. Cleanest lake in North America. That's what the textbooks say. That's what they announce on television. That's what the tourist brochures promise. That's how it should be. And in the archives of the Federal Fisheries Research Station, now part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, building in Silver Spring, Maryland, in a climate-controlled storage facility where visitors aren't allowed, there's a file stamped "Official Use Only" in faded red ink. Inside, the reports of Dr. Elwood Whitmore on his 3-year study of fish populations in the Keweenaw Peninsula, 1942 to 1946. The numbers in the reports are smooth, neat, showing stable, healthy populations. No pathologies, no anomalies, no warning signs. Perfect data for a perfect lake. The kind of data that raises no questions, triggers no investigations, justifies no expenditure for cleanup or remediation. But beneath those pages, at the very bottom of the file, lies a small yellowed note, written in Elwood's careful hand on his last day at the station. A note he slipped in there, hoping someone would eventually find it, someone who would care enough to act. Just one line, penciled on a scrap of paper torn from his field notebook. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 91 underscore, underscore. That note has never been seen. It sits in the archive, waiting, like the cans in the forest wait. Maybe someday an archivist will find it. Maybe a historian researching Cold War environmental history. Maybe a graduate student writing a dissertation on Great Lakes ecology. Maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe it will sit there forever, yellowing further, ink fading, paper deteriorating, until one day someone cleans out old files and it goes to the shredder without anyone reading it. Elwood Whitmore's story is the story of thousands of honest people who tried to tell the truth and were crushed by systems stronger than individual integrity. It's about how institutional lies are more powerful than individual conscience. About how silence becomes normal and truth becomes crime. About how good men make bad choices in the name of good causes. About how civilization runs on secrets, and some secrets are worth killing to protect. It's about the terrible arithmetic of war, the moral calculus that lets decision-makers weigh 10,000 dead fish against 10 million dead soldiers and conclude the fish don't matter. It's about how temporary environmental damage becomes permanent when the temporary solutions are never implemented. It's about how national security classifications can hide crimes for generations until everyone who could have testified is dead and the evidence is rotted away. It's about a man who believed in science, in truth, in the slow, patient accumulation of facts that would eventually force institutional change. Who learned too late that facts without power are just words on a page. That truth, without the ability to speak it, might as well not exist. That integrity is admirable but insufficient when faced with systems designed to protect themselves at any cost. Elwood died believing he had failed. Maybe he had. Or maybe his failure was the success. The fact that he tried it all, documented what he saw, preserved the evidence even knowing it might never be found. Maybe that small act of resistance mattered more than any publication would have. Or maybe it was all meaningless, the gesture of a man who couldn't accept that some fights are unwinnable. We'll never know. History doesn't remember Dr. Elwood Whitmore. No Wikipedia entry. No historical marker at the station site. No mention in environmental history textbooks. He lived, he taught, he died. Like millions of others whose names are forgotten before their grandchildren are born. Superior is still called the jewel of the Great Lakes. Tourists come every summer, families in minivans, couples in rental cars, photographers chasing the perfect sunset shot. They take photographs, marvel at the beauty, buy postcards and souvenir t-shirts proclaiming, underscore underscore quote underscore 93 underscore underscore. Scientists conduct research, publish papers, receive grants to study water quality and fish populations. The lake is clean now, they say, recovered from whatever industrial impacts it suffered during wartime expansion. Nature's resilience demonstrated. A success story of environmental recovery. But what are they measuring against? If you don't know what was lost, how can you know what was recovered? If the baseline itself was poisoned, if the underscore underscore quote underscore 94 underscore underscore you're comparing to is already degraded, then recovery is just another word for forgetting. The lake might be cleaner than it was in 1946, but is it as clean as it was in 1941? Does anyone even remember? Does anyone care? But Keweenaw remains closed, and no one explains exactly why. The official justification changes over decades, protecting endangered species, preserving archaeological sites, preventing soil erosion. But the restricted zone never shrinks, never opens. Somewhere in that forest, under layers of moss and decades of fallen leaves, in a crevice of ancient limestone worn smooth by glaciers 10,000 years ago, 2 ammunition cans hold the truth the world didn't want to hear in 1945. Inside those cans, if they haven't rusted through, if moisture hasn't seeped in and destroyed everything, photographs of diseased fish, field notebooks filled with Elwood's careful handwriting, tissue samples preserved in formalin, detailed maps showing contamination patterns, letters he never sent, data tables showing the real numbers before they were falsified. Evidence. Proof. The kind that could rewrite history, force accountability, prove that the official story was a lie. Or could have, once. Now? Now it's probably just historical curiosity. The people responsible are long dead. The project they were protecting is declassified or obsolete or both. The contamination is either cleaned up or so diluted by time that it can't be traced back to source. Justice delayed becomes justice denied, becomes justice forgotten. Maybe someone will find them. Maybe not. Superior is silent. Water flows. Time passes. Waves wear down granite. Forests grow and burn and grow again. And the truth waits, patient as stone, for someone to care enough to look. This story is a work of fiction. Dr. Elwood Percival Whitmore, Dr. Virgil Drummond, Dr. Leonard Kessler, Warren Latham, and all other characters are entirely fictional. The Federal Fisheries Research Station in Madison, Wisconsin, as depicted here, never existed. The specific events described, the contamination of Lake Superior's fish populations during World War II, the government cover-up, and the suppression of scientific data, are products of the author's imagination. Lake Superior today is one of the cleanest and most pristine large lakes in the world. It is carefully monitored and protected by both United States and Canadian environmental agencies under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Modern fish populations in Lake Superior are healthy and sustainable, closely managed by state and federal wildlife agencies. This story was written to explore themes of institutional power, scientific integrity, and the moral complexities faced by individuals caught between conscience and authority, particularly during times of national crisis. It is not a historical account, not a factual claim, and not an allegation about any real events or organizations. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.